any other cyber-related activities. So the forum members themselves are made up of ITAG member companies, Cyber Ireland also, industry startups, SMEs, large enterprises, academia, Enterprise Ireland and IDA. Basically all coming together for, I suppose, to contribute to the growth of cyber awareness in the Western region. The idea for Cyber Tuesday was actually started by the ITAG Cyber Forum over 2 years ago now, and basically to encourage knowledge sharing and industry growth, inspiration and networking opportunities. So we're delighted to have teamed up with Cyber Ireland and the other region forums this year to bring the cybersecurity to a wider audience for a national tour, for the want of a better term. Just before we get to introduce Martin, our guest speaker today, we'll just do some, I suppose, general housekeeping. So the format of the presentation, obviously, I'll just give a brief intro into Martin. Martin will then outline his, go through his PowerPoint presentation for us. And maybe if we keep the questions maybe till the end, where we have a dedicated time for the Q&A. As part of the Q&A then just after that, I just want to give you a bit more information about future events that are happening. And then we'll sign off with a few thank yous and have you out in time for your lunch, hopefully at 1:30. So with further ado, I want to introduce you today to our guest speaker, Mr. Martin Kelly. Martin is, I suppose, an unsung hero in the technology sector in Ireland in many ways. He spent most of his career, I suppose, in leadership roles in the technology industry, having led international teams right across Europe, America, Australia, and Asia. He obviously is a firm believer in giving back. You know, since he's moved on from his position as global vice president in Citrix, where he was heading up that 400 people, he has gone about, I suppose, giving back in terms of being really a positive influence in terms of strategic advice, directions, and guidance to, I suppose, SMEs, NGOs, charities, etc. During his time, I suppose, at Citrix, Martin was one of the key people in driving employee engagement, and even was recognized in the top 5% of global Citrix vice presidents for this particular type of engagement. Today, Martin is here to talk to us, I suppose, with dealing or living through a security incident and what lessons can be learned from such a type of scenario. So again, we'll keep the questions, if you don't mind, please, till the end, so Martin has finished his presentation. And without further ado, Martin, I shall stop my screen share and hand over to you to present your presentation, please.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Jason. Am I driving, or are you going to drive?
No, you can drive now, Martin. Yeah, I've stopped screen sharing there.
Okay, I don't have the presentation on my, it's disappeared from my screen. But,
okay.
Maybe if you drive it, Jason.
Perfect. Sure, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Not appearing on mine. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I am very grateful for Jason for that very flattering introduction. It makes me sound, I hope I don't disappoint this morning, but delighted, or this afternoon, delighted to be here with you, and happy to share some of my real world experiences of dealing with cyber attacks. I think I know that there are people from many different types of organizations here, and on a topic as broad as cyber, it can be difficult to pitch a message so that it's relevant to everyone, from large complex organizations to small SMEs. So I keep the messages and the lessons learned, I suppose, as useful, as simple as possible, so that they can be applied in large scale. Although I will say that most of my experience has been with large scale IT and cyber organizations, so there may be a bit of a bias towards that, but I do think that the lessons learned are as valid, you know, perhaps in a slimmed down way for smaller companies. And just as there are, you know, lots of different types of organizations here, there are many different types of cyber attacks. And again, what I'm going to cover today is not so much going into the detail of the nature of the attacks, although I will reference that, but more about how, from my experience, how best to respond to them. And this is not, it's based to some extent on theoretical models, but it's very largely based on practical experience of being in the coalface, if you like. So if you just advance to the agenda, so that's kind of my background. But as Jason said, I'll explain a little bit more about my background, because I didn't realize Jason was going to go through as much as he did. But just to explain, the context of where I come from, so basically my introduction will just cover a little bit about my own background. Then I'll talk more about, how likely an attack is, because I suppose like cybersecurity is like, it's a risk management exercise, and good risk management involves looking at two variables. One is how likely is something to happen, and the other is the impact of that happening. And I'll talk a little bit about the likelihood of an attack, how it's more likely to be discovered. Then, not to sort of lead with a negative or anything, but just some pointers on how not to respond, because there's often a very initial temptation to respond in a way that might actually do more damage than good. So there's an element of how not to respond. Then I'll talk about, from my experience, what best way to respond. And some of these are not based on the way I responded, by the way. They're the way I, in some cases, didn't respond, so that they're lessons learned from a hard world experience. And then I'll talk more specifically about some real world lessons, some of which I've been involved directly in, some of which I know about indirectly, and some of which are sort of general, public cases, I suppose, that are out there. Now, I may add a bit more color to some of the examples that I've been directly involved in because of my inside knowledge. So I assume that what do they call it? The Chatham House rules apply here, that, what happens within these walls or not. But I think everything I've covered, I've tried to keep it at a level that is useful for people who are in this space, and also is not breaching any confidentiality on the part of any companies I've worked for or worked with. So next. So yeah, as Jason said, I spent my entire career in the IT industry. I initially worked with companies like Deloitte, GE Capital, GlaxoSmithKline. I worked and lived in Australia, USA, and worked across most of European countries. I spent from the year 2000 actually to 2008, I worked for Citrix, which at the time was a small, little-known company. And I helped establish, I did establish their European services, technical services center. Later went on to head up technical support for Citrix globally, and eventually moved into information technology, where I was head of IT for about 8 years. And I obviously was in that role that I was most directly exposed to the cyber side of things. I suppose I spent a long time in the company, but it was very small when I started, and it was very large when I left. When I started, there were a few hundred employees. When I left, there were 10,000 and revenues of over 3 billion. So it was a bit of a roller coaster ride, but it was great fun. There were great people to work with, and I really enjoyed it. And since I left Citrix, I'm now a board member and advisor to CIOs and CEOs on various things related to IT, strategy, cybersecurity, and how getting technical direction and people aligned, I suppose, as Jason said. Employee engagement is one of the areas that I was most comfortable in, I suppose, and as in everything else with cyber, the technology is part of it. The people side of it is getting that lined up is an even bigger part, as we'll see as we go through. So next. So some stats, and again, I may be preaching to the converted here in terms of the audience, but the likelihood of a cyber attack, these are just some numbers that are out there in terms of. So Hiscox is a security insurance provider, and they obviously have a vested interest in knowing the things like likelihood of attack. But some stats available on that. It shows that 61% of US companies and 58% of UK companies experienced a cyber attack in 2020. Smaller companies are more likely to experience a breach, and that's partly because the bigger ones are getting better at defending themselves, but also because they're the smaller companies, there are more of them. So the reach of cyber is increasing. And the cost, and again, these are averages, and it's an average is probably not the best way of looking at this, but the message, I suppose, the average cost overall globally is about 3.8 million for a cyber attack. Now, I can say from direct experience of the cases I've worked on, even in small organizations, the cost is very high of a cyber attack. So I suppose the message there is not so much the 3.8 million, because that may seem small in a big organization, but in every organization I've worked on, the impact, the initial cost, and it's not just the financial cost, it's also the reputational cost and so on, but the impact is significant. And obviously these stats only account for what's been reported, but it's estimated that around half of all cyber incidents go unreported, and that's a stat that is worrying, because as I'll talk a little bit more later about, I think it's the secrecy around cyber and so on that is actually inhibiting us moving forward and getting on top of some of the practices and getting better at being able to get out in front of it. So just move on one then, Jason, please. And then your likelihood is also influenced by the nature of organization you are, and the percent of investigations carried out by a company called Mandiant, who are probably, in my experience, they're probably one of the best, if not the best, at cyber forensics. They 25% of investigations that they do globally are in government. I won't go through each and every one of those, but you can see that the large scale organizations, professional, financial, high tech, are most targeted. And there's reasons beyond just the financial ones for that, in that these organizations have what cyber professionals are looking for most nowadays, which is data. They're looking for access to data because of regulation and because of standards of protection of privacy and so on. Organizations are very exposed if data is lost in a cyber attack. So they're moving towards wanting access to data, and these organizations, it's like the old joke about why do you rob banks? It's because where the money is. They attack these organizations because they have personal data more and more. One other point just worth mentioning, and I was a little surprised it wasn't higher, but high-tech industry. So people may think that cyber attacks are more targeted at organizations that are not in a position to defend themselves. But actually, most high-tech companies, and Citrix is in that category, have had very good cyber defenses, or better than most, I suppose, but they're still a target because there's the bad actors, if you like, are moving in some cases at a faster pace than the companies can respond. So next. So just, I suppose, in terms of likelihood then, and again, I may be preaching to convert it here, in that the reality is that cyber attacks are more likely to happen than not, and the most common types of attacks, and again, I'm not going to go down through each and every one of these, but that the most common types of attacks are, the malware, phishing, denial of service attacks, and most of the organizations I said earlier, most of what they're looking for is data, and most of those attacks occur because of employee mistakes or human error. So it's still very much, human error is still very much the driving force behind the majority of cyber attacks, and what they're looking for are entries into an organization and then to exploit some vulnerabilities that may already exist once they're in areas, hardware, software, physical site exploits, and also looking particularly at perimeter devices that are accessible via the internet. So things like firewalls, virtualization solutions, and virtual private networks, or VPNs, are a target. And in one interesting statistic, again in the Mandiant discovery, is that in about a quarter of the investigations they do, they identify that more than one threat actor is involved. So that within an organization, there's more than one attacker or hacker involved. Sometimes they're collaborating, sometimes they're coincidentally there because of the fact that the exposure is there. So these threat groups are working together very often to accomplish a common goal. And this, again, reiterates the importance of, if the actors are doing it, if the bad actors are doing this collaboration and cooperation in order to share information and knowledge, then I think it's important and incumbent on us as professionals to also share knowledge and practices and ideas of what will help improve the security posture of the organizations that we work for. So next. So cyber discovery, and again, I will mention before I go too much further that what I'm not going to talk about today is how to improve your cyber posture, because there's a lot of information, a lot of good organizations and consultancies out there advising on what companies need to do to improve their security posture. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that because A, because it's well covered, and B, because I'm trying to provide, I suppose, the experience of how to deal with it if it does happen. So, but how it's likely to be discovered, the cyber monitoring, you would hope, is going to uncover activity in your environment that's unexpected or shouldn't be there. Criminals contacting you directly, law enforcement contacting you, third party, also ethical hackers, people who are security professionals who find their way to expose a weakness in an organization and let them know out of the goodness of their heart. Now, it's interesting that some of the non-ethical hackers or some of the bad actors will justify their existence by saying they're providing a service. It's like hacking as a service. They expose a security weakness in your organization, and the ransom is their fee for exposing that. So they kind of spin it in a way that makes it sound like they're doing something noble. And I suppose to some extent they are exposing a weakness, but doing it in a way that is not. But there are people in the ethical hacking business, very often the people who were on the other side of the fence, who now perform an ethical hacking function and expose security weaknesses for organizations. Or you may find that you just get the old classic 404 page. But as I say, in about a third of those organizations where a hack has occurred, there's more than one. There's more than one intrusion and more than one actor at play. And the other interesting statistic in terms of how discovered is the majority. I think it's around 40% is for data theft is the target. But it's also interesting that at the moment the majority of hacks are discovered by external parties, not by internal security monitoring. Now, the external party may be one of the ones mentioned here, as I say, or it could be a service supplier. If you have part of your IT environment outsourced, for example, it could be an organization that's doing the security monitoring for you. But just some interesting stats on how it will be discovered. So next. So I suppose then, and again, some of you will have seen this kind of scenario before, where people say it's not a question of whether, it's a question of when a cyber attack will occur. But I think it is, in summary, I suppose it is very likely that a cyber attack will happen. It's a question of when. And if you are one of the lucky few who's avoided an attack, then now is the time to start and be prepared for when that happens. So we know that having solid technologies, processes, and people strategies in place to prevent is critical. However, we also know that the very best preventative actions in place, even with the very best, it's still very likely that a breach will take place. And it's interesting that some of the very largest cybersecurity incidents ever recorded, SolarWinds last year or the year before, Yahoo, Microsoft, Uber, the list goes on, have been in companies that have got generally good cyber defenses. So what I'm saying here is that it's very likely that it will happen, and it's really important that you have a clear plan for how you respond. And the final point on this slide, it's something I feel really strongly about, is that we shouldn't be embarrassed about the fact that a breach has occurred, because, as I say, even the very best defenses can be breached by the sophistication of some of the attack now. And I think that sense of embarrassment is what holds back a lot of the knowledge sharing or exposing, good practices that other organizations are doing. And as I say, from having been on the side of dealing with these, I really feel it's important that as cybersecurity professionals, we need to get better at collaborating and sharing that information so that we can reduce the damage. And I think it's a little bit like, I feel a little bit like when I do a talk like this, a little bit like I'm at one of these addiction counseling sessions saying, hi, my name is Martin, and I've been a victim of I was head of IT in an organization that was hacked. But I have no problem with saying that, because it's not a source of embarrassment. It's not a badge of honor either, but it happens. And I think it's important that we are mature enough to face up to it and say that, what do we learn from it? How do we prevent it? And how do we, and collaborate with others to make sure that we share best practices around, dealing with this. So I think more of that is, it's still a source of embarrassment, and still quite a few, the metric I mentioned earlier, about half of cyber incidents are not reported to anybody outside the organization, is a real worry, because that knowledge sharing could very much help other organizations to get out in front of it. Okay. So not to be kind of negative and start on the how not to, but I think it's important just up front. There's a few pointers I would say of how not to respond. And again, some of this is based on experience, and some of it is just common sense, frankly. But not having a plan, not having a formalized way of being able to kick off an action plan or a series of actions to expect a cyber. I think, as I say, it's likely to happen. So the time is in advance of it happening is to have that formal plan where expectations, priorities, channels of communication are clear on what to do. And frequently, responses to cyber incidents fall down almost immediately at this point, because there isn't a formal plan. There's a lot of people standing around looking at each other saying, you do this, you do that. So that's kind of message number one. I think that probably falls into the obvious category of what should be done. The second one is responding too quickly. And I'll mention later in the specific examples I've been involved in where that happened. When you are first made aware of a cyber breach, the initial reaction is a very human one of let's put a lid on this, let's respond immediately, and let's get things back on track. But sometimes you can respond too quickly in a knee-jerk way and try and, I suppose, bury the incident without necessarily fully understanding the scope of what's actually happened. And sometimes in doing that, you can actually do more damage by, for example, deleting evidence or changing systems in a way that could prevent a true diagnosis or forensics being carried out. So I think you have to be a little careful of responding, too quickly in a way that could potentially compromise any future or further investigation. And so in that case, without having the evidence to follow through or to follow the forensics of it, you may end up not really getting to root cause of what happened or the full scope of what happened. And the third one is about responding too slowly. And again, this can happen for understandable reasons, that people are, as I say, embarrassed, or for the human reason that if you're responsible for an area like I was for IT, and IT security was part of my responsibility, and a breach occurs, the natural human reaction is to say, let's try and keep this under wraps as much as possible. And that can generate a slow response, which could then cause, sometimes it's caused by pure panic, but sometimes it's just caused by not really knowing what to do. And as I say, it goes back to the failure to plan and failure to coordinate up front. So next one. So there's a few key takeaways for today, I suppose, to messages around how best to deal with this. And there's a whole, there's a lot of documentation available on how to prepare a good incident response plan. But I can't emphasize enough the importance of having a detailed incident response plan in your organization, with key responsibilities, with key contacts of exactly who does what, identified up front, the roles and responsibilities of parties involved, and the kind of the typical framework is in an incident response is to, the initial preparation, the identification of the incident, containment of it, eradication, recovery, and then importantly, lessons learned. Now, we could spend probably the entire session talking about the elements of an incident response plan, and I'm happy to follow up if anybody has one specific examples of how one might look. But I think the initial response and the confidence to be able to respond in a way that will lead to good outcomes is going to be bolstered by having a good response plan in place and ready to go. And part of that has also got to be about the communication of and notification of the various parties that need to be notified, some for legal reasons, like regulators that may need to be responded or notified, employees, suppliers, media, insurance companies. There's a whole swag of different people, but having that clear up front of who they are, what they are, and how we're going to respond to them is really important. Even down to having draft communications in your incident response plan that says, this is what we're going to say to regulatory, this is what we're going to say to customers, etc., if and when an incident is responded to. And I've seen examples of really good practice in this area, and frequently it involves a communication, for example, that says, we have been breached, we are investigating it, and we will provide details as they become available. So not necessarily specific, because you frequently don't have the specifics, but being able to go on the front foot and provide regular updates on where exactly you're at is really important. Next slide. Yeah, having the plan is one thing. Testing it is absolutely critical, and this sort of tabletop exercise is what I would call it. And this is something that I'll talk a moment about the Citrix specific incident, but it is something that we did a lot of, and it wasn't just related to cyber, it was related to business continuity. We had business continuity plan that was regularly tested, not just desktop, but also we would literally shut down systems from time to time and run through a scenario of how we would recover if SAP, for example, went down at a quarter end when we were processing orders. How would we recover from that? And we did this exercise not just in a tabletop, but in a real life scenario. We shut down SAP and tried to bring it back up or recover from that. So we did this not just for cyber, but we testing your incident response plan related to cyber is really important. And then some of the audiences that are frequently forgotten, I've listed here, because board of directors, I'm on the board of a company that had a cyber breach, and they did a reasonable job at communicating at a certain level, but nobody on the board was aware of what was going on until it was too late, and that led to problems further down the track. So making sure you have an audience, a target audience identified of who needs to know what, and testing that exercise so that you can, draft up, as I say, the communications that go to the board, the C-suite, the organization as a whole, the technical team, and then obviously externally to customers, to suppliers, to external organizations. And one of the things that came up, I think, at the conference last week was increasingly the Garda cyber team are interested and available to help organizations that have suffered from breaches as well. And not necessarily one that you would immediately come to mind, but there is expertise there and advice, particularly perhaps for smaller organizations, as to how to respond and make sure that that's part of your incident response plan, is that you have a clear idea of how you're going to communicate, who's going to do it, and in what kind of time frame, and that is tested in advance of the incident itself. Next. Okay, so let's kind of move a little bit from the high-level theoretical into the reality. And I'm probably one of the oldest on the call, but this was a 70s British TV show, Dad's Army, where the initial reaction when something like that happens is to say, don't panic, but you may feel like saying it in a way that sounds like you are panicking. So don't panic. And the other gentleman that was there was constantly looking at the negative as we're doomed. He was a Scottish, but I think so. We're doomed. And that is the initial response, is that you feel like absolutely panicking. And when people find out, there's a whole sense of panic around, we're all doomed, our careers, our livelihoods, etc. So next slide. So I think that the first thing is, as I've said earlier, if you've got the incident response plan, kick that off into action and get people on board who need to be on board to deal with the issue. I would say, from my experience, and again, it's been with large scale organizations, but I would say the same applies to smaller. Very quickly in the process, you should engage third-party security forensic experts, right? Because internally, it's hard to have the expertise required of these people. And I've worked with a few different ones, and they don't have to be the large organizations, but people who have specific experience in security forensics can save you a lot of time and money by jumping in early and guiding. They can determine initially the nature of the attack and whether it is likely to be a sophisticated one or a standard, run-of-the-mill one, and that, I would say, a lot of organizations do that too late in the piece, and that can cause problems further down, in that you have to redo work, or your recovery plan is based on the wrong forensics. So I would say get that in security forensics in as quickly as you can, and those organizations tend to work on the basis that they are sort of like the fire service. They're available to be called in at short notice, particularly for large organizations. Your incident response team, as I said earlier, without repeating it all, it's about having the roles of each one of those, and not just the technical side of it, but also the legal, the data protection officer. Obviously, there's a legal responsibility now if organizations lose secure data or privileged data, that they have to report that to the data commissioner. PR, messaging, HR, and the board, getting them on board. And then at the appropriate time, and with the forensics guidance in place, be able to lock down systems so as to prevent the spread, and then prepare the communication that hopefully you've already got drafted in form within your plan to customers, suppliers, and the various people involved. So I think with that plan in place, you're able to go on the front foot, because I can tell you from real experience, it is a pit of the stomach feeling when you find out that this has happened, because your life flashes before you in terms of, gosh, this is something I'm supposed to be in charge of, and it is a sickening feeling. And when you think that, one of the reasons why CIOs or heads of IT are reluctant to admit to these is because, the average tenure of a CIO, I think I saw somewhere, is less than 4 years. It's the lowest of any C-level in an organization. So there is a natural fear to think, gosh, I can't let this out. But trust me, if you have your plan, your incident response plan in place, you can go on the front foot, engage the right forensics people, and you can frequently get the issue resolved, or at least under control very, very quickly. A slow response to that can delay and cause rework to be done later down the track. Next. So I'll move on to some real world examples then, and then we'll allow some time for questioning. So this was back in 2015. As I say, I was head of IT for Citrix. That was the infrastructure and operations. I had a security team under me, and that security team identified suspicious activity on the network. We weren't sure what it was, and so they had originally come to me saying, look, we think we need to do this, we're not sure, but it could be that. And so we decided very early on, let's get some forensics experts in. And thankfully we did, actually, and that's probably, you know, convinced me then and subsequently in any other case I've been involved in, that these people can really deliver a huge amount of value if they're brought in very early. As I said, we had an incident response plan that was part of a business continuity plan, and that worked pretty well in terms of getting initial response in place. The breach was when the forensic people came in. It was clear that the breach had occurred by an employee clicking on a attached Excel file that had malicious. But to our surprise, the forensic team told us to do nothing for a while. So they wanted to come in and monitor exactly what the bad actors were doing in the environment. And it was clear after a while. We set up a war room, and it was like one of these movie scenes where they were monitoring what they were doing on the environment, down to things like they could establish that they were most likely in China because of the time of day they came in. They started working at, you know, Chinese 9 o'clock, if you like, and finished at Chinese 5 o'clock. So they were able to establish that what they were doing in the environment. They felt this was important. Before we start trying to shut down, we need to understand what they're likely to be after and what they're doing. And then after we were clear on what it was, it became clear that what they were after was source code. So they were moving source code around on the network, staging as they call it, in anticipation of then taking it off the network. So they were moving around in the network, but not actually taking anything off the network at that point. But the advisors, forensics experts, were saying that most likely it's at a point they will then try to take that off, and you've lost valuable source code. So once we got to a point of clearly understanding what they were about, we had to do a overnight without notice password reset across the entire network, which is chaos because there were 10,000 employees in the organization. But we did that. It was incredibly painful, but it worked. We were then able to see that when we came back up after the password reset across the environment, the activity we had been monitoring was gone. So it was it had worked, and as a result of that, there were lots of lessons learned, but one of the most important lessons was that we decided that IT security needed to be a separate team. And even though I had security under my responsibility, I was more than happy with that because it was such a specific area of expertise. And this is back in 2015, quite a few years ago now, but we established security as a separate team within the Citrix organization, completely separate and reporting line to IT, which was good. So that's kind of one real world example. I'll move on because I know I'm just conscious of time, not wanting to. So I left Citrix in 2018, and so, but I'm not saying there's any link between the fact that I left Citrix in 18 and there was another hack in 19, but there was a separate hack in 19. This time it was they were alerted by the FBI, and when I left Citrix, and one of the reasons I did leave, actually, again, this is confidential, but the CIO that I reported to had left, and they decided to bring back the security and IT into one organization under the person who was the CISO. I didn't, because of the pain that I'd gone through when we had it all in one organization previously. I didn't agree with that. I thought we should have separate, security should be separate to IT. But anyway, the decision was made. And it was one of the reasons, wasn't the only reason. But I left around 18. But interestingly, when the two organizations merged and we had a more security focused head, if you like, because he was a previous CISO, we had a bigger hack take place. And again, that's not to blame him, it's just to say that this is the reality of it, that this time it was password spraying that had been at the root point of entry, if you like, and they discovered it had been in the network for 5 months. And this time the scale of the breach was much higher, and this is public knowledge. So it's not, Citrix is a public company, so it has to report on these things, and it's public knowledge, so it's not breaching confidentiality, say the size and significance of it. But it was a very, very painful, very expensive breach on that occasion, and significant negative comment around the organization. But I think the lessons, I wasn't there when the lessons learned was carried out for that, but I do feel, and I'm pretty sure that they have gone back to having a separate CISO specific organization as opposed to IT and security being part of one organization. Next. This is another one. I was involved in an organization that had a large Irish, I wasn't working for them, but I was helping them, where they had a ransomware attack. And in this particular case, they responded too quickly in that they had a very outsourced type model of IT service provision, and they immediately went to one of their service providers to come in and do the forensics. And you know, that was difficult because they were one of the vendors that was responsible for managing the environment in which the breach occurred. And so I was asked to get involved, and we decided to move towards engaging an independent forensic expert that was specific to this area. So it meant that the initial work that they had carried out had to be redone, basically. They lost time and money, but the end result was that the true cause was identified. The forensics was very detailed and showed that the hacker had been in there for a lot longer than originally anticipated. And we established a cyber subgroup to help with the whole restoration process, to make sure, because there were lots of different vendors involved, that make sure that there was an oversight of the recovery. And they did a good job in terms of communication to the external part. They had a lot of very sensitive data, but they did a good job of communicating externally to the media, to the regulator, employees, politicians, and actually they were, and I think it was a good example of people can forgive an organization if they are proactive and open about what's happened, and they're less forgiving if there's an attempt to kind of hide what's happened. So I think this organization learned the lesson that perhaps they responded too quickly. They also were inclined to blame. Before I got involved, when I went in, I was told that X vendor was responsible for this hack, and I said, look, guys, let's not assume blame to anybody at this point, because that's one of the biggest problems when a hack occurs, that people are immediately looking for someone to blame. And my comment is always that at the end of this exercise of detailed forensics and analysis, there'll be enough blame for everyone to share. And there usually is. There's no one cause of these things. There's usually enough blame to go around. So it's really important. And this organization initially started down the route of saying, we know who it was, they didn't do this, it's their fault, and I said, no, forget that. Let's just get the forensics in, look at the whole picture, make sure we understand the size and scope of it, and fix it, and then do the lessons learned post-mortem, which we did, and showed up that there were weaknesses with that particular vendor, but lots of other weaknesses that needed to be addressed and were. So that was the main lesson out of that one. Not too quickly press the blame button, not press it at all, actually, because it's very counterproductive. There's usually more than one cause for these things. Okay. The other real world example, I won't go through all of this, but we all know about the HSE, and again, this is publicly out there. But I remember hearing the HSE on the radio, and they were obviously they're an organization to get a lot of attention and a lot of they're under a lot of pressure for all sorts of reasons. So I remember when they were on the radio the day after the hack, or the day of it perhaps, and they gave the impression that they thought this was a very sophisticated sort of zero-day breach, that, you know, a vulnerability that had never been seen before, and so there was definitely an impression created that this was something very unusual and out of the ordinary. Now, understandable reasons, I suppose, they felt on the spot, but as things know, and again, the full response post-mortem on the HSE breach is available publicly, carried out by Price Waterhouse. It's quite a detailed document, but it showed up lots of things, not least of which was that they didn't have a documented cyber incident response plan, and really hadn't done a whole lot of work preparing for activities in a formalized way, which meant that when the you know what hit the fan, they were kind of scrambling to come up with a messaging with PR that maybe made it sound like they were on top of it when they weren't. Now, they've done a lot of good work, and I think they are, you know, investing in it, but it did show up that this wasn't actually a particularly sophisticated attack. It was a fairly simple, rudimentary one almost, but it had a very, very damaging and very costly impact on the HSE. Next. Okay, and again, lessons learned there. Again, this is well documented. It's well worth reading that, although it's quite long, but it is well documented what the lessons were. And it was, you know, they didn't have specific cybersecurity responsibilities. They didn't have the adequate resourcing and lack of accountability and ownership. So there's a lot of good lessons for anybody to learn, be it a small or large organization, from what happened in the HSE. So just to wrap up, I know we've got about 10 minutes, but just in terms of next slide. Yeah, key takeaways, I suppose. The first thing is, you know, don't panic, expect a breach. It is becoming more and more likely, and be ready for it by having an incident response plan that you have as a live document that's tested regularly, that you can refine and improve based not only on what happens within your organization, but based on what's happening around, you know, other companies or other organizations or other practices in other countries. And communicate. I can't emphasize enough the importance of getting on message and not coming across as defensive or blaming, or, you know, sounding like you're trying to minimize something. Be open about it. If you don't know exactly the scope of it, then say that. If you do, then, you know, communicate during it. And by most of all, when it happens, if it happens, when it happens, recovery is part of it. The lessons learned have got that post-mortem, and lessons learned part of it is really fundamental to ensuring not just that you are in a better position to handle it, but as I said earlier, that we as professionals in this space should be sharing more of these lessons learned in a more open way, and not feeling embarrassed about it, because it could happen to anyone. So with that, I will leave it there for now. Thanks for your attention, and I think we may have some Q&A. If there's any questions or any comments that anybody would like to make, I'm happy to field those.
Thanks, Martin. Great takeaways there. It's great learnings to be heeded to with your experience and stuff to date. So thank you very much. Yeah, so if there is any questions, please feel free to pose them now, and we'll get Martin to respond accordingly.
So I have one on the line. Thank you for in your opinion, should preferred security forensics be identified and included in your incident response plan? What level of preparation regarding security forensics would you recommend? Yeah, that's a good question. I depending on the size of the organization, I think there's a lot of security vendors out there that will say they do security forensics, and some do it very well, although they also do, you know, sell security services as well. But I would have that identified up front as maybe a panel of 2 or 3 that if you're a large enough organization. I think it is important, because you don't want a security professional to come in and try and sell you something. In fact, in one of the cases, I was asked to approve. This was one I was advising a company. I wasn't working for it, but I was advising it. But I was asked to approve or to comment on a recommendation that came from their security forensics team to move to a different to move their environment from an in-house to a cloud environment, and this was in the middle of the cyber attack. And I was saying of the forensics, and I was saying, hold on a second, what's the? It felt a little bit to me like I said the analogy was you've got a leak in your house, and somebody knocked on the door and offered you a new kitchen, and you're thinking of buying it because it's a good offer. I was saying that you've got to focus on getting the security forensics completed and signed off, and then you may well decide to move your environment from where it is to. But you've got to be clear on what's the priority, and that in that case they were being confused by what the vendor was saying, because they did some forensics, but they were also offering additional services which didn't actually relate to the security incident, but they saw an opportunity to sell something which wasn't. It was eventually going to happen, but it wasn't needed at that time. So I think the security forensics preparation, there's a lot of detail behind what level of preparation regarding it, but I would say it would begin with having one or two preferred vendors that you at least have some awareness of their capability. So another one then, how can professionals strike balance between knowledge sharing about these experiences and not violate? Yeah, that's a great question. Not violating confidentiality of the company. Do you think the incoming Institute Forum and other regulations on sharing organizations would make a difference, or will organizations still be wishy-washy? Yeah, that's a really good, it's a difficult one. And that's why people are reluctant to come forward, because, but I suppose in a way that other professions, be it the medical profession or the legal profession, that there are ways in which knowledge sharing can take place within within a constructed, maybe there's an opportunity for Cyber Ireland or somebody to facilitate something like that, to provide a safe space for these types of things to take place without it being exposed as either for confidentiality and or exposing potential weaknesses in a company. I'd love to say I have the answer to that. I'm not sure exactly how we do it, but I'm pretty clear on, in general, we should be doing more of that, because mostly it's not breaching corporate confidentiality that's the problem. It's just embarrassment about the fact that something happened. That's the inhibitor. But good questions. Are fines a disincentive to report breaches? Yeah, I mean, they probably are. However, if it's an obligation, a regulatory obligation to report, for example, a data breach, which it is, and you don't report it, and it's discovered, and these things have a habit of being discovered. Like, for example, in one of the organizations I was helping, it had not been communicated. We were working on the communication plan, and a journalist called up and said, "I hear you've got a security breach, and can you provide more?" So it was like, it gets out very, very quickly in this country. So I think it perhaps is a disincentive, but it's very hard to hide security breaches of any scale. So I think again, I would err on the side of being more open about it if you need to, because it may well put you on the back foot if you don't. Okay. Any other questions, Jason, or are you?
No, just on that, in terms of the disincentive to report, it's just there's a new legislation coming in from the European Union in June, and it's a redress directive. So basically what it means is, if companies found to be breached GDPR, there will now be legislative bodies that can take actions against those companies who are found to be a breach of legislation or GDPR legislation or infringement. So it's the first time ever, I suppose, we're actually seeing a litigation piece. So further to your GDPR fine or your cost of recovery, etc. From June this year, people's data who've been exposed can now go to designated institutions within the European Union and seek redress. So I think the days of people having to worry about just a GDPR fine will kind of fade into the sunset. And then equally, just on the previous question, Martin, there is a CISO forum being set up by Cyber Ireland for that very reason, to share learnings and confidential knowledge sharing within a safe space. You can reach out to Cyber Ireland directly around that, and I'm sure Owen Byrne and his colleagues will have plenty of advice in terms of the forum that's going to be set up for that particular reason.
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions at the moment. Sorry, there is just one coming in. Yeah.
Thoughts on the sea of vendors claiming to solve all or part of the cyber challenge? Playing on fear. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, playing on fear primarily. And that's why, you know, today I didn't want to cover what you should do to prevent, because there's so much out there that people will say. And the reality is that even with the very best of defenses, it's likely that it would be. There's a likelihood of a breach, as I said, is there. So I would be reluctant. I don't want to make a generalization, but I think that it's very hard for vendors to credibly say that they cover all of the cyber challenge, from prevention to education to forensics, recovery, and all that. It's a big field, and it's a very specialized field. So I would, again, if you're a big organization, I wouldn't be going to one vendor for all of that. And I think that the fear mongering is if you're a smaller organization, you may well be able to. And there are some professionals that do have, the Chinese walls between their vendor selling part of cyber and their forensics part, and they do some pretty good work. But I'd be a little careful. Thoughts on cyber insurance? Yeah. I suppose it's necessary particularly for larger organizations. The caveats and the conditions under which, like most insurance, it's once you read the detail, you can often find that but I would say it is a must-have for larger organizations, and it's becoming more and more sophisticated in terms of the insurance companies will get access to exactly what's going on, and that's why they can be a good source of information about what's really happening in these breaches and what size and scope they are.
It's one of the questions there, Martin, that came in, just around the communicate openly, and are your hands not tied once your cyber insurance kicks in that they will take control of the comms side and dictate what the organization can or can't say about the hack or the breach in terms of your insurance policy.
Yeah, now that may well be the case in the insurance situations that I've been involved in. The cyber insurance has not been dictating the communication side of it, but again, it depends on the policy. It depends on the nature of the insurance company. But they're trying to manage their risk as well. And if your hands are tied there, then so be it. It's not been my experience though that we've been tied by insurance.
Just finally, Martin, there's another couple coming in here. So with the new NIS version 2 directive coming in, does the panel think that this will help global coordination or escalate attacks as to potential reward increases? The NIS2, does the panel think that will help coordination? I think it will help coordination or escalate attacks as the potential reward increases. Yeah, I mean, it's I think the hacks are going to increase anyway, and the potential reward is higher. So yeah, I hope it will help, but it's obviously yet to be determined. Okay.
I see somebody, Helena worked with me at Citrix years ago. So nice.
Yes, many years ago, Martin. So good to see you.
Nice to see you again.
You
Thanks
too.
for your comment. Great. All right. I think we're about up on time, but if anybody else wants to shoot me a message, I think Jason and Joe will have my contact details. So thanks again for your time, and stay safe out there, as I say.
Thanks, Martin. And just before we finish up, just to not let you go without just highlighting a couple of key events that are coming up. One of those is the ITAG Cyber Forum, which we're delighted to announce as part of the Atlantic Festival. The cyber event will take place on Tuesday, the 16th of May, between 4 and 7 p.m. Again in the Genesis building in Bonham Quay in Galway, where it was last year. You know, some fantastic guest speakers, so we really encourage you to come along. We're covering such topics as the threat landscape, major incidents, lessons learned, incident responses, all very appropriate to today's talk as well. There will also be a panel discussion titled Large and Small, Are We Learning the Right Lessons? The full program of events can be viewed on the Atlantic website, which is atlantic.ie, and we would look forward to seeing you there. And then one other quick call out is the Cyber Research Conference, which this year takes place in the ATU in Letterkenny up in the Northeast on the 24th of November. And the ask here is that the call is out for papers and it's open, and we invite both academic and industry submissions. You can find out more on the website cyber-rci.com/2023. So that's cyber-rci.com/2023. Just to finish off, I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank Martin again for his wonderful time and his presentation. I'd like to thank obviously our ITAG Cyber Forum members, particularly also Caroline and the wonderful Joe, who provided great support and assistance. Thanks to Cyber Ireland for their support. Again, thank you all. We look forward to hopefully seeing you either at the Atlantic Festival or further cyber